All right, let's unpack this research paper you've sent over, Cancer as a Metabolic Disease.
Mm.
The title alone has got me intrigued.
Yeah.
It seems like we're really going to challenge this traditional view of cancer as like primarily a genetic disease.
Indeed, yeah.
Get ready for some aha moments, folks.
What's fascinating here is that while we've, focused so much on the genetic mutations in cancer,
Right.
this paper's highlighting a potentially even more fundamental aspect,
Yeah.
the way cancer cells generate energy.
So from the paper, it looks like we're going to be exploring this idea that cancer at its core
Yeah.
could be a metabolic disease.
Exactly.
And that impacts not only how we view cancer, but how we might approach treatment and prevention.
Absolutely.
So let's start with the basics.
Sure.
How do cells produce energy? Because that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah. So there are two main ways that cells produce energy.
Okay.
Oxidative phosphorylation and substrate-level phosphorylation. So oxidative phosphorylation, you can kind of think of it like the super efficient electric car of energy production.
Okay.
This happens inside these tiny powerhouses in the cells called mitochondria.
Right, mitochondria.
Mitochondria, exactly. And it's the preferred method for healthy cells.
Got it.
Now, substrate-level phosphorylation occurs outside of the mitochondria, and it is less efficient, but it's sometimes necessary.
So we've got our electric car,
Yes.
which is very efficient.
Yes.
And then we've got, I don't know, our gas guzzler.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so the paper is focusing on how cancer cells seem to be stuck in the gas guzzling mode,
Yes.
even when they have access to the electric option.
Right?
So why would they choose the less efficient path?
Yeah, that's the Warburg effect, and it's kind of a head-scratcher.
It's like deliberately opting for a Hummer when there's a Tesla sitting right there.
Precisely, and that's where the paper gets really interesting.
Okay.
It suggests that maybe cancer cells aren't actually choosing this inefficient pathway, but rather they're forced into it,
Okay.
and the culprit,
Yeah.
damaged mitochondria.
So instead of being a choice, it's a consequence.
Exactly.
Tell me more about this mitochondrial damage.
All right, so there's a crucial component of the mitochondria called cardiolipin.
Oh, okay.
And you can think of cardiolipin like the battery in our electric car analogy.
Okay.
Now, the paper highlights research showing that in cancer cells, this cardiolipin is often damaged.
Interesting.
So essentially, it's crippling the mitochondria's ability to produce energy efficiently.
So damaged batteries equals a sputtering electric car,
Yes.
and it forces you to rely on that gas guzzler.
Right.
Okay, I'm following you so far, but how does this connect to, like, cancer's hallmarks,
Right.
The uncontrolled growth, the spreading, all that stuff.
Okay, so that's where the retrograde response comes in.
Retrograde response.
Yeah.
That sounds very ominous.
It kind of is. Imagine it as a cellular distress signal. So when the mitochondria malfunction, the cell is trying to adapt and survive.
Right.
So it switches to those less efficient substrate-level phosphorylation pathways.
Okay.
It's basically a desperate attempt to stay alive, but it has consequences.
Consequences, you've got my attention.
So this prolonged state of emergency
Okay.
can lead to genomic instability,
Which
basically means DNA damage.
Right.
And as we know, damaged DNA is a hallmark of cancer.
It is.
So it's like the cell's emergency response backfires and inadvertently creates the very conditions that allow cancer to develop.
Whoa. This is starting to paint a whole new picture of how cancer might even arise.
Right.
So are we saying that damaged mitochondria
Potentially. Yeah.
through this retrograde response could actually be a driving force behind those characteristics we associate with cancer?
That's the fascinating hypothesis this paper puts forward.
That is fascinating.
And what's even more intriguing is how this metabolic perspective could change our approach to managing cancer.
Okay, hold on tight, listener. We are about to dive into how this metabolic theory could revolutionize treatment and even prevention.
It's pretty amazing.
Don't go anywhere. All right, we just uncovered this fascinating idea that damaged mitochondria could be like a key player in cancer development.
Yeah.
So how does this new understanding change the game when it comes to treating this disease?
Well, it opens up a whole new avenue for treatment by targeting the very processes that cancer cells use to survive.
Okay.
And one of the most intriguing approaches is using a strategy as simple as what we eat.
You're talking about diet.
Exactly.
Like food can actually help fight cancer.
Yeah, the paper highlights the potential of dietary energy restriction or calorie restriction.
Okay.
And by reducing our overall calorie intake,
Right.
we can limit the availability of glucose, which is the primary fuel source for those inefficient energy pathways that cancer cells rely on.
So it's like we're cutting off the supply lines to a factory. We're starving the cancer cells of their fuel.
That's the idea. But what's really fascinating is that while this impacts all cells, right?
Right.
Normal cells are much more adaptable.
Okay.
They can switch to alternative fuel sources like ketone bodies.
Ketone bodies.
Ketone bodies, yeah, think of them as the backup generator kicking in when the main power goes out.
Okay.
So we're kind of flipping the switch to a different energy source.
I like that analogy.
But can cancer cells use these ketone bodies?
Oh, that's a good question.
Well, many types of cancer cells have difficulty utilizing ketone bodies because they need those functioning mitochondria that we talked about earlier.
Right, their batteries are damaged.
Exactly. So this makes calorie restriction a potentially powerful tool.
Okay.
You're targeting the cancer cells while giving normal cells a fighting chance.
This is absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah.
But I have to ask.
Yeah.
Calorie restriction sounds pretty intense.
Uh-huh.
Is it safe?
It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
And it's crucial to consult with a healthcare professional before making any drastic dietary changes.
Of course.
But research, particularly in certain types of brain cancer, is showing some really promising results.
This metabolic approach just feels like such a game changer.
It is.
Hitting cancer from multiple angles.
Right.
But calorie restriction isn't the only weapon in our arsenal, right?
Absolutely not.
What other metabolic strategies are out there?
Researchers are also developing drugs that directly target the metabolic pathways that cancer cells depend on.
Okay.
For example, there's 2-deoxyglucose, or 2-DG,
Okay.
and it's a molecule that essentially tricks cancer cells into taking up a fake fuel.
So it's like sabotage. We're
Yeah.
sneaking in a wrench to jam up their machinery.
Precisely. And
Yeah.
that's just one example. There are other compounds being investigated that specifically inhibit enzymes
Right.
involved in those inefficient energy pathways.
Got it.
So you're disrupting the cancer cell's ability to generate energy.
It sounds like we're entering this era of precision medicine,
Yeah.
targeting cancer's metabolic Achilles heel.
I like that.
But earlier we talked about how some cancers rely heavily on glutamine,
Yes.
not just glucose.
Yes.
So does that change things?
You bring up a great point. Not all cancers have the same metabolic dependencies.
Right.
Some are indeed more reliant on glutamine, especially certain types of leukemia. And this is where research is now focusing on how to target glutamine metabolism as well.
So it's about developing a personalized approach,
Yes.
figuring out each cancer's metabolic fingerprint,
Exactly.
and then tailoring the treatment accordingly.
That's the goal.
Wow, the possibilities are incredibly exciting.
They are.
Imagine combining calorie restriction,
Yeah.
these targeted drugs that disrupt specific pathways,
Right.
and, traditional treatments like chemotherapy. It's like a multi-pronged attack,
Yes.
addressing both the genetic and metabolic aspects of cancer.
Exactly. We're finally starting to understand the language that cancer cells speak.
That's a great way to put it. But are there any downsides or challenges to this metabolic approach?
Well, there are always challenges in science.
Of course.
And one of the biggest here is fully understanding these complex metabolic networks
Right.
within cancer cells. They're incredibly adaptable,
Right.
and they can find ways to compensate when we try to disrupt their energy production.
So it's like this constant arms race.
In a way. Yeah.
We target one pathway and they find a workaround.
Right. But that's the beauty of scientific research.
Yeah.
It's about constantly learning,
But
adapting, and developing even more sophisticated strategies to outmaneuver cancer's survival tactics.
I'm feeling a renewed sense of hope, knowing that we're moving beyond simply fighting the symptoms
Yeah,
and starting to address the root causes of this disease.
absolutely.
This metabolic perspective just feels like a turning point in our understanding and ability to treat cancer.
I agree. We've only just scratched the surface, but the potential is immense.
It is.
And it all starts with recognizing the importance of metabolic health, not just for cancer prevention, but for overall well-being.
And that brings us to the big question.
Okay.
What does all of this mean for our listener,
Right.
for the individual trying to make sense of this complex disease?
Yes.
We'll explore that in the final part of our deep dive, so don't go anywhere.
Welcome back to our deep dive into cancer as a metabolic disease.
Yeah?
We've explored some pretty complex science.
We have.
From those energy-producing mitochondria
Right.
to, this idea that cancer cells might be stuck in like a less efficient metabolic mode.
Yeah. It's a fascinating concept.
But let's bring this all home.
Okay.
What does this mean for you, the listener?
Right.
Why should you care about, cancer cells and their quirky energy preferences.
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that this knowledge really empowers us.
Okay.
It shifts our focus from being like passive recipients of treatment to active participants in our own health.
So it's not just about battling bad genes.
No.
It's about creating an environment within our bodies
Yeah.
that makes it harder for cancer to thrive. Exactly. It all starts with those classic healthy habits we often hear about.
Right.
Not smoking, limiting alcohol, maintaining a healthy weight, getting regular exercise.
Yeah.
They're not just like vague advice anymore.
Right.
They're concrete steps towards protecting your mitochondria
Okay.
and minimizing that metabolic dysfunction
Right.
that can contribute to cancer development.
And we talked about calorie restriction.
Yes.
Which, while it requires careful consideration, guidance from a healthcare professional, of course,
Absolutely.
could be a really powerful tool,
Yes.
both in managing and preventing cancer.
It's a fascinating area of research, and while more studies are needed,
Right.
the potential is definitely there. But beyond these specific interventions,
Yeah.
what I find really empowering is this realization that every choice we make, from what we eat to how we manage stress,
Yeah.
can impact our cells and their metabolic processes.
It's like we're taking control of the environment that those cells live in,
Right.
making it less hospitable to cancer.
Yeah. And as research continues, we're likely to uncover even more ways to kind of exploit those metabolic differences
Right.
between cancer cells and healthy cells.
Imagine a future where we can tailor treatments to target the specific metabolic vulnerabilities of each individual's cancer, leaving healthy cells unharmed.
It's a really exciting prospect.
It is a future where our understanding of metabolism becomes as crucial as our understanding of genetics
Absolutely.
in the fight against this disease.
I agree.
So, listener, as we wrap up this deep dive into cancer as a metabolic disease, we encourage you to think about what resonated with you.
Yeah. What stood out to you?
What new questions or insights emerged?
Right.
Keep those sources coming.
Please do.
And we'll keep exploring these fascinating topics together.
Absolutely.
But before we go, I have one final thought for you to ponder.
Okay.
We've talked about how cancer cells rely on different fuel sources
Right.
and have varying abilities to adapt. Could there be ways to exploit these differences even further?
That's a great question.
Could we, for example, develop therapies that essentially trick cancer cells into starving themselves while providing healthy cells with the resources they need to thrive?
It's a question that researchers are actively exploring.
Right.
And the answers could revolutionize how we approach cancer treatment and prevention.
It's a reminder that the journey of discovery never ends.
It doesn't.
Oh, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It was a pleasure.
And until next time,
Yeah.
keep those brains buzzing.